Welcome to the WTR Healthcare Happenings podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's special Flashcast podcast episode, I'm being joined by my healthcare equity research colleague, Robert Sassoon, to share his thoughts on President Trump's recent executive order to accelerate research, clinical trials, and so-called right-to-try access for such psychedelic drugs as psilocybin and MDMA for medical purposes. You can also read Robert's recent industry report on the topic, which can be found on Water Tower Research's open access website. Good afternoon, Robert, and thanks for joining.
Great to be here with you again, Tim.
First off, can you give us some context and tell us what concrete mechanisms this executive order puts in place to help therapeutic psychedelics?
Sure, Tim. So there are 5 mechanisms incorporated in the EO to support psychedelics development and access. One is the National Priority Review vouchers for breakthrough designated psychedelic therapies. That's really to accelerate NDA review from the standard 10 to 12 months to a matter of weeks. 2, a right to try expansion, creating a pre-approval access pathway to allow terminally ill or seriously ill patients to access psychedelic therapies before full FDA approval is granted. And that's an area where the US is a long way behind Canada and Australia. 3, a sequenced rescheduling commitment triggered by phase 3 completion, directing the Attorney General to initiate DEA scheduling reviews upon phase 3 completion rather than post-approval, potentially compressing the gap between NDA pre-approval and commercial availability by up to 90 days. 4, there's a $50 million federal funding, which will match state research programs to broaden the clinical evidence base and accelerate development pipelines. This seems to be a modest amount, but nevertheless, it's a signal that the federal government wants to encourage research in psychedelics. 5, IND clearance for ibogaine, which removes a specific regulatory barrier blocking its clinical investigation and opening a formal development pathway for a compound with relevance to addiction and PTSD treatment.
So that covers a lot of different topics on this EO or executive order. What do you see as the most consequential of these mechanisms, Robert?
Right. So in my view, and probably the view of many others, the most consequential near-term action is the Commissioner's National Priority Review voucher, which can, as I say, shrink NDA review from 10 to 12 months to a matter of weeks. Now, a very recent precedent highlighting the impact of the voucher system is Eli Lilly's GLP-1 weight loss drug, Foundayo, whose NDA was recently approved after a record 50-day review from NDA filing. So I'm not saying that we will get psychedelic approvals around 50 days from NDA filing. The Lilly drug was a clean oral small molecule with a conventional delivery model, whereas a psychedelic NDA is typically more complex because it will carry a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy or REMS requirement, session monitoring protocols, and perhaps therapist credentialing standards. Nevertheless, its inclusion in the EO indicates that the FDA wants to reduce NDA review time. On the EO's right to try directive, it's an important, we call RTT, it's an important goal to broaden use of existing early access pathways, which in the US, as I noted, is way behind the likes of Canada and Australia at the moment. It is potentially the most structurally significant mechanism in the EO. However, the issue with the EO vis-a-vis RTT is that it does not itself expand the statutory framework, meaning that RTT in the US still requires a life-threatening condition, exhausted approved options, inability to join a trial, phase 1 completion, and an active IND. And it does not override the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA, absent a separate legal basis. So in 2025, it's worth noting that the Ninth Circuit decided against a Seattle-based palliative care physician who sought a DEA waiver from CSA Registration Act requirements that would have allowed him to administer psilocybin to terminally ill patients under RTT laws. That rule remains a significant barrier, and the EO, remains a significant barrier, and the EO cannot raise it by directive alone.
So things are very nuanced from what I'm hearing from you. What, if anything, is missing from the executive order, in your opinion, Robert?
Now, that's a good question. I would say 2 things: reimbursement and rescheduling. Reimbursement is the more consequential gap, The EO establishes no coverage framework, and without it, post-approval uptake faces real friction, regardless of NDA review speed. Now, on the rescheduling, the EO does direct the Attorney General to initiate DEA reviews, but doesn't mandate an outcome. So the DEA retains full statutory authority and has historically moved pretty slowly. And one live cautionary precedent is the marijuana rescheduling EO from December 2025. Presidential signature, DEA inaction thus far.
Great. So all that having been said, Robert, for our investor base, who are the likely potential winners here?
So let's start with the sector. At the sector level, I think the EO is more a signaling positive event rather than a structural one, representing the first, but it does represent the first clear federal endorsement of psychedelics as a legitimate therapeutic class. And that signal matters for capital formation, institutional credibility, and could broaden historically limited large pharma engagement in the sector. But as with all drug developers, all these factors hinge on the specific candidate's safety and efficacy profiles. So, in that sense, psychedelics are no different from an immunology or an oncology candidate. As for near-term beneficiaries, these are likely to be the three companies slated to receive national priority review vouchers imminently for breakthrough therapy designated programs. So while the recipients were not named at the signing by Makari, the commissioner of the FDA, he indicated that the vouchers would go to three serotonin 2A agonist programs. So that narrows the field a bit. So the most obvious candidate is Compass Pathways, which following having back-to-back phase 3 successes for COMP360, it's a primary asset in treatment-resistant depression, and it's also planning a rolling NDA in the fourth quarter of this year. As for the remaining two vouchers, well, if you assume the programs closest to NDA preparation and submission are the ones that are going to be included, these could come from a small pool of serotonergic breakthrough designated phase 3 programs. They'd include Dephinium Therapeutics' DT120, which is an LSD-based therapy for generalized anxiety, depression, and major depressive disorder. Helus Pharma, which has its lead asset is HLP003, a psilocin-based treatment for major depressive disorder. And then you have Uzona's Institute's phase 3 US SPICE psilocybin program for MDD too. That's a non-profit company. You've also got Atai Beckley's BPL-003, which is due to begin its phase 3 trial in the current quarter.
Well, great. Thanks, Robert, for joining us and supplementing your great report yesterday with this Flashcast podcast to kind of flesh out further detail. Have a great day.
Thank you, Tim. Bye.
Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, industry-specific symposiums, and conference schedules. We will see you next time for another edition of the WTR Healthcare Happenings podcast. Finally, a special thanks to the producer and editor of the podcast, Krista Fitzpatrick.